We're starting the topic of super diversity, where we talk about this word that we sort of introduced about 2 weeks ago, late modernity. So late modernity is the name that's given to the current times that we are facing of interconnectedness and increasing migration, globalization, all this information exchange from sciences and media and economy and business, all these global movements, global flows that are causing our traditional boundaries as we know it, according to some sociologists, to be fuzzy or in a state of flux. This has a number of different implications, but today we're talking about the term super diversity and how it falls into this late modernity time and late modern time, and specifically super diverse spaces or cities. Okay, so take it away. Yeah. With today's paper. Yeah.
I can't share. I need permission.
Oh, I thought I made you co-host.
Yeah, but this is you made me co-host for the account I'm using with the camera, because I'm using the camera with my phone
and the other one. Okay. Okay, I didn't know that part. Okay, so take it away, Jan.
You'll have to excuse me for the noise, because I don't know if you're hearing it. Loud noise.
Nope.
Okay, that's good. It's a really, really loud noise. Anyways, so yeah, my topic is super diverse repertoires and the individual by Blomert and Bagels. First of all, this paper is very introductory and it talks more about a critique to the traditional view to understanding social linguistics, particularly the words. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Particularly the word repertoire. So this paper in particular talks about three key concepts in the field of social linguistics, which are linguistic repertoires, means of speaking, and speech communities. So the paper starts with a brief history about how these three concepts traditionally in linguistics are studied separately. So the purpose of the study is to link these three concepts into one whole definition, into the definition of linguistic repertoire. So for this paper, for the authors, these three concepts are one of the same. So what's the purpose, the general purpose of this study? To better define the concept of repertoire, considering an approach on super diversity. So the paper tries to, I don't know if you can see the point. Okay. Tries to define the concept of repertoire considering the perspective of super diversity. So instead of seeing it as in the traditional view, we try to see it in the super diversity context. So the paper also tries to describe the pattern of learning, the means of language. So a little history on what inspired the study of super diversity and the study of repertoire, linguistic repertoires. So it all takes place to post-Cold War. I'm sorry, there's a really loud noise outside. So, give me a moment. I'm sorry, están construyendo ahí aquí al lado del cuarto mío.
That's very unfortunate, but no worries, I can still hear you despite the noise. Can you hear yourself though?
No, anyways.
Okay,
So
take it easy.
The history starts with post-Cold War. In 1991, after the fall of, the Berlin Wall, so the world previous to 1991 was divided in two factions: those allied to the Soviet Union, Russia, and those allied to the United States, which were called the Allies. So during that time, the world didn't have that kind of flexible communication we have today. So migrations were limited and communications also were limited. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, migration started to increase, and so on global communications. And new technologies emerged, such as the internet, which allowed a more effective communication between countries. So why is this important, this history fact? Because it led to populations to become increasingly diverse, which in turn has implications in how we understand and apply concepts such as minorities, communities, and diaspora. So this is why it is important. This increasing diversification now makes it possible to transcend the borders of political, national, and ethnic boundaries that are in society. For example, now neighborhoods can be multi-ethnic, not necessarily has to be confounded by Jewish people. Now Jewish people can be in the same neighborhood as Chinese people and Mexican and etc. So we can maintain cultural and social, religious and political and economical ideals and practices, even though we are far away from the community that we originate from. So all of this makes all of these facts of diversification makes the study of social linguistics more difficult and problematic. At least that is if it is approached from the traditional paradigm of social linguistics. So what do the authors propose as an alternative to understand these problems in light of these increasing diversity? So they offer the superdiversity paradigm. So what is the superdiversity paradigm? So they say that associating people to particular groups is no longer relevant. Particular groups, meaning ethnic, sociocultural, and national groups, now isn't that necessary. So there is a low presupposability of identity, social and cultural patterns of behavior, social and cultural structures, norms, and expectations. When the authors mention the term presupposability, they refer to how we make a quick, judgment and assumptions of people. So in the super diversity paradigm, we start understanding people in terms of their environment and context. So we don't assume that a certain practice of a person equals to an identity of being Japanese, or because the person practices has some norms in its household, that person is Mexican, or etc. Or certain expectations of the person doesn't mean that person belongs to a cultural or whatever group. So the super diversity paradigm sees the person in its context and not on its own practices. So the incapacity to attribute these elements to ethnic, sociocultural, and national groups also translates to the inability to presume people belong, to a particular language group or cultural group. So what implications does the super diversity paradigm has in sociolinguistics? Number one, an increasing problematization of the notion of language in its traditional sense. Number two, language is seen as an emergent and dynamic pattern of semiotic practices. Por lo menos solo that's what the authors say. Someone wrote in the chat.
Oh yeah, that's me just putting future notes. You don't have to pay attention to my notes. I'm just leaving reflexiones. But if I have any questions, I'll ask you.
Okay. So the second bullet, an example of this is the term of languaging that we talked on Thursday on last lecture, and also polylanguaging. The paper also makes a reference to. So the third point implication is that there's a detachment of language practices from groups, from speech communities and culture, meaning that, no longer we associate different forms of languaging or to a specific speech community or culture. So speaking a certain way doesn't mean that you belong to X group or specific group. So number four, we have viewing groups only as emerging patterns of semiotic behavior with different degrees of stability. So these degrees of stability refer to how long do language practices persevere and how influential they are. For example, a speech community, the paper makes reference to how speech communities can be either big or small, or they can be enduring or ephemeral. And number five, viewing the individual as multiple identities, polycentric, or engaging in different social environments. So with these notions in mind, we gain a better understanding on how we build the linguistic repertoires, also known as the means of speaking. But first of all, it is important to know how we gain them through experience in context. So the authors make an emphasis on the concept of learning language. So in pragmatic terms for linguistics, learning should be called acquisition. Why? Because there's a difference between the word learning and acquisition. Learning implies that we learn, but we can then unlearn what we acquired. Contrary to the word acquisition, that implies permanency to the knowledge acquired. So linguistic resources are acquired permanently and can't be unlearned. And the acquisition of resources create temporary and dynamic grammar practices. And the acquisition of resources can often replace grammar practices. So how can we see these examples in real life? For example, a 6-year-old is very different from a 12-year-old and a 40-year-old in terms of grammar practices. When we replace grammar practices, we replace them through our development. How? Well, maybe when you were a 6-year-old, you spoke in a certain way with specific words and particular meanings. However, through your development, and you replace with new knowledge your grammar practices to one that is appropriate to a 12-year-old, for example. And therefore, when you get to your 50s, then you replace your grammar practices from your 12-year-old to one that it's appropriate to a 50-year-old. So these grammar practices are always changing and dynamic according to the context in which we are engaging. This in particular, I'm from psychology. I'm not very familiarized with the field of linguistics, but I can make connections with the psychology field. And this reminds me a lot about the theories that Jean Piaget proposed. I don't know if you have ever heard of it.
I have.
So Jean Piaget was a developmental psychologist, also cognitive psychologist. And he, in his theory of development, he made an emphasis on language acquisition based on knowledge construction, which he called ¿cómo se llama? Schemas, he called them. So Piaget talked about how during the pre-operational stage, we gain those basic functions of language, and then in the operational stages, we gave them a social meaning to language. So in the operational stages, which are after 12-year-olds, after 12 years of age, you start replacing the way you think, the way you speak, the way you behave. You start accommodating because you start giving meaning to your knowledge. So the learned knowledge of language, according to the authors, is dependent on biography. It is impossible to know it all. It is a repertoire based on the rhythm of our lives. So biography, when they say the word biography, they are referring to our everyday experiences, to our lives, to the rhythm of our lives. So how do we learn the means of speaking? How do we gain the repertoires? So repertoires are not developed in a linear fashion. Repertoires can be learned explosively or intensively and gradually in different stages of life. So the exposition to literacy resources can be an example of how repertoires can be learned explosively or gradually. For example, during our early school days, we gain a lot of linguistic resources from our experiences, from school, from our houses, from playing with our friends and whatever, from experiences, particularly academic experiences. So during those early stages of our school, we become very strong in 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 linguistic repertoire. However, that that linguistic repertoire that we have acquired in those early years becomes some sort of a scaffold for our later knowledge buildup, for our later linguistic repertoire. So that later linguistic repertoire is gradual. It's not instant like in the early school days. It comes gradual. We use old knowledge from early days, from early years, and we start to build up gradually. So repertoires are the result of polycentric learning experiences. So these experiences can be either informal or formal. Formal, uh, it's like going to school. Informal, doing something extracurricular or doing it on your own, not under any institution. So polycentric learning experiences can be reflected on how we access, on how we gain access to to certain communities and groups in society. So that in effect has an impact on how we learn. So this impact, as I said, can be formal or informal. And another example of informal experience can be, for example, browsing through the web or watching YouTube videos for learning a particular skill or learning a language even. So the authors identified 3 ways that we can acquire knowledge of a language through experience. The first, we have the comprehensive language learning that refers to the full socialization of language across all our lifetime. So this kind of learning leads to a fully and maximal acquisition of the language resources. So in the comprehensive language learning, you are mostly exposed to the language across all your lifetime. Instead, the specialized language learning is particular to specific stages in your life for particular linguistics skills or resources. And then there's the encounters with the language that refers to those encounters in different stages of life with different people with varied exposition to language that would generate linguistic knowledge, accordingly to, for example, you were exposed to age group slang. So when you were a teenager, you started copying the slangs that teenagers like you were engaging. Temporary language learning, single word learning. Single word learning, an example of that is, for example, learning how to say hello in Chinese. Everyone knows how to say hello in Chinese. It's ni hao, pero, or saying I don't know, a word in a foreign language. Pizza, I don't know, pizza Italian. Well, it's Italian, the word pizza, but it's an example of an encounter with the language. You're not necessarily exposed to the language constantly, but you have been exposed temporarily in a very slightly way.
Yeah, so it's like, it kind of reminds me a little bit like when we're talking about intertextuality, no? Like there is no such thing as a language of a video game specifically, like referencing Sylvia Sierra's article, but that you learn the phrase or you learn the word or algo specific to this practice of playing this particular game or whatever. And then that's like an encounter with a specific language or a specific register. The same happens with people that watch foreign television shows or international movies. Like you pick up on stuff, you have virtual or semi encounters, or if you've lived abroad as well. So it's kind of like a passive, very passive relationship with a language. It's not active like the other ones, like you mentioned, like comprehensive and specialized. Encounter, we all have encounters on a daily basis through different means. Yeah.
And those encounters, well, will determine to a certain point your level of competency that the authors later make reference to. So there's also another type of encounter, which is embedded language learning. That basically is the language of the technocrats, those that are engaged in programming, for example. Because around the world, there are many programmers that speak different languages, but the programs are based on the English language. So they are exposed to some English content to a certain extent.
It's like a blend of English and algorithms. Como que va a aparecer el programming, like your mind needs to work, like needs to understand those puzzles, but then it also follows English syntax. But yeah.
Yeah. So this paper, they talked about a case, a one subject study in understanding how a person can acquire a repertoire or a linguistic repertoire. So this person apparently they tried to study how many languages could he understand. And in this case, they tried 38 languages. And from those 38 languages, he could recognize at least all of them. But again, the level of competency would depend between languages accordingly to the level of exposition the person has had with the languages. Considering these two facts, that the experience can be formal or informal. So linguistic repertoires can be evaluated on 4 categories of competence. The first, maximum competence. I think the word says it all. Fully understands oral written language, is capable of engaging fluently and informal settings. So in this case, this person, this subject could speak at the maximum competence English and Dutch. However, languages such as French and German, Dutch isn't supposed to be here, it's German. Languages such as French and German, the person was relatively fluent in understanding and engaging in the language. However, in formal settings, the person did have a little bit of difficulty. I'm gonna show you an example of partial competence. The minimal competence, the person understands the basics of the language and can engage in routine conversations and routinely everyday experiences. An example of languages in the case of this person were the Italian, Japanese, Chinese, and many other languages. So minimal, it's basic conversations just to survive in the everyday life. And recognizing competence is basically the recognition of the symbols and sounds of the language. The person barely understands. Maybe one word, maybe, but the person doesn't understand, only recognizes the sound and the symbol. So, for example, many of you have seen Chinese characters. You will probably, if you see a Chinese character, you would say, "Oh, that's Chinese." You know it, but not necessarily you understand it. So you would be in the Chinese language at the recognizing competence level. So in that level, the subject had a long list of languages from those 38 languages. Also, one's ability to understand a language might fit in any of those levels. The authors explain that within one level, any of them, within one level, the person might differ in a specific skill. For example, in the next slides, I will show you how in French and German, although they were both under the partial competence level, they did differ in specific tasks of the language. And there are also similarities. How much time do I have left?
You're good in terms of time because you're the only assigned speaker for today. Then we have on Thursday, somebody else talking about superdiversity from a different perspective.
So in this example, this is a case of the French language in the same subject. The person in a formal setting, the spoken production was restricted. But in the informal setting, the person was very advanced, could speak very fluently. The spoken reception, written production, written reception, it was advanced in the formal settings, except in the written production. He did not write at all. But in formal settings, he was very advanced and average. But when you compare it to German, which was also in the partial level of competence, he was very different in performance, both in formal and informal settings. If you see in the informal setting, the spoken production was advanced. However, in the informal setting, he was very restricted. So if you see both, you can see that in French, he could speak more than in German. However, in written reception in informal setting, for German, he was average. And in French, he was very advanced. So you see these particular elements of inside the level of competency were significantly different, even though they were both languages were under the same level of competency, the partial level of competency. This one. So you can have many languages in one level of competency, but not necessarily be exactly fluent in both languages, or three, or whatever, how many languages you know, because each language has its own, you can perform each language differently in different skills, which are spoken production, spoken reception, written production, written reception. So those sources of knowledge, what were they? Well, the subject current linguistic repertoire is a collection of formal and informal language experiences. Those language experiences, you must remember, that can be informal or formal. So the exposition to a language varies in strength and in context. For example, your native tongue. In our case, in Puerto Rico, our native tongue is Spanish. So Spanish becomes a strong variable in terms of our level of competency in Spanish. So a reason, our source of knowledge for knowing Spanish and having a full level, a maximum level of competency in Spanish is because Spanish is our native tongue. However, in the case of this subject, his maximum level of competency were Dutch and English. So he was very exposed since early age, since all his development, he was exposed to Dutch and English. So they were sort of a native tongue to them, to him. So he also went to school and studied extracurricular languages like Greek, Italian, and Japanese, and many others. So this context, and during this time in particular that he took those courses, he gained that knowledge for that language, for those languages. So he became competent to those languages. Also, French and German were in those, but because he was using French and German most, he became partially competent in those two languages. Informal learning environments, that an example of that would be studying it for fun, or engaging in the language for fun or out of your interest. You want to do it, you start doing it. So the factor of motivation also plays a role in how we acquire knowledge. Also, the factor of traveling. The subject used to travel a lot, so he was exposed to many other languages, so he could recognize even the symbols and the sounds. And of course, there's also the life in the neighborhood. So your experiences in informal settings like neighborhood also impact how you build up that knowledge. So notice that the resources learned were acquired in context of specific lifespans. So, for example, going to school is in a context, in a specific stage of your life. Maybe in 7th grade, you took a course on French, for example. So that is a context in a specific lifespan. Also, you can notice that the source of knowledge could be acquired through different places. Like, for example, you went traveling, so traveling also helps you to maybe get to the level of recognizing competence level and engaging in different activities. So these dynamics in which we acquire language make the definition of repertoires well, more difficult, more complex, making the traditional perspective of social linguistics a little bit more inefficient and unfair when studying the communities of speech and studying what linguistic repertoires are. Why? Because the traditional perspective of linguistics sees language sort of a static thing, and speech community sort of a consolidated thing. So the super diverse paradigm tries to see language in a context, not in a closed group. Am I explaining myself? I don't know. Okay.
Yes.
So what is a repertoire? This could be better explained as a record of human mobility across the world that reflect technologies, social contexts, migrations, and learning experience and learning environments. Even, I could say, even activities, social activities. So all of these interactions, all of these components in terms of human mobility our repertoire. So instead of seeing repertoires as accumulation of simply knowledge, linguistic knowledge, it's better to see it as a knowledge built on all these things. Migrations, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed, migration started to happen, and therefore many communities, many neighborhoods became less homogeneous, for example. So people were starting to be more exposed to languages, to different languages, in the case of the United States. So now the concept of language becomes a little bit more difficult when you add these factors, these different factors that makes visible the diversity in society. So also reflect the use of technologies, for example. Globalization has been possible since the introduction of, for example, the internet and technologies, and many of these technologies are in English. And these technologies also have allowed to break up the boundaries, the political and geographical boundaries between countries. Now someone from Puerto Rico can learn Chinese in YouTube. Now someone from France can start a conversation in Spanish with someone in Mexico, for example. So all of these factors, when you see it in terms of human mobility, you sum it all, you add it all up, and you can understand better what a repertoire, a linguistic repertoire is. So linguistic repertoires, like in the beginning, where is it?
So can I just say something?
Yeah.
So what I like about this reading, by the way, I want to clarify something that was happening in the platform that I just recognized right now, that under assigned readings is the article that under articles for presentation, está el artículo that he's talking about. But then under the thematic layout of our e-courses, está hay otro, which was meant to be the background reading. And that one's like 4 pages long. And then the one that he's discussing, which is in articles for presentation, is longer for anyone that, read one or the other. Just know that there's two. Lo que pasa es que no estaban los dos. The presentation one, for some reason, wasn't under our theme. That's what I wanted to say, my first comment. My second comment is in relation to what I appreciate about John Blumark's work and Bacchus, even though I'm not too familiar with his work. But even though I don't fully on subscribe to any of these terms that we've been talking about recently that use terms like descriptions like transcendent and making boundaries fuzzy and recognizing the mobility, it makes sense to me, right? But my own perspective is I'm kind of in midway on those topics. But what I wanted to say about this particular paper is how he recognizes the different levels of multi-competence. And in fact, everyone is like this in real life. People always talk about what does it mean to be bilingual. ¿Verdad? Y en Puerto Rico se habla español, inglés, or whatever, right? So I remember one time I was interviewed by this guy in an AM radio station, probably nobody heard, but whatever, my mom heard. But he was asking me questions about bilingualism and what was my advice for parents who wanted their child to be bilingual, multilingual. And I remember that at the time, well, what I emphasized was, know that language is like an instrument. No, it's a symbolic system. You need to practice it consistently. It's not practicing one language over the other. That was my answer to him, right? Because, and I was saying this thinking about what I've researched in terms of bilingualism in Puerto Rico, as well as my own experience. So there's this misconception in Puerto Rico that private schools or English only schools are the key to bilingualism in our island. It makes sense, no? Our context is Spanish speaking outside in informal settings. So why not make the school in an immersion school? So then children can learn standard English, right? That's the kind of argument. But it's not good, because what's happening then is that you're schooling people in these English immersion programs to be able to talk about different content, different subjects at advanced levels in English and standard English. But then when it comes to engaging in these same topics in Spanish or in standard Spanish, there wasn't enough opportunities for them to develop their standard Spanish outside of Spanish class. So it's like the reverse situation happens. So then you have people that can speak in a register, in a very good formal register of English, but then their formal register of Spanish and essay writing is questionable, right? And then in public schools, you have the reverse situation. You have, and even worse, because our outside settings are Spanish. So if our school is also in Spanish, then how can you even tackle different language competencies in one English class for public schools? So, the idea here is that, as Jan was mentioning, this whole perspective of multi-competence, building on our life experiences, our exposures, whether they're fully competent, partial, or what was the other word? I wrote it down.
Recognizing.
Recognizing.
Minimal.
Exactly, recognizing. So you have to think about these different layers of knowing something. You want to make space or room for people to engage and practice and put that tool into use, put that language tool into use. So, my argument in that interview was that, okay, so if you want your child to be fully bilingual, right? Whatever that means, because usually there's always one language that's more dominant than the other. But if you want your child to be able to speak in different registers of Spanish and English, what would be the ideal case is that to give them both equal weight. And, within Puerto Rico, it's always one or the other. And I think that doesn't even help the case, because we see languages as well as very polarized in Puerto Rico, as ideologically colonized or colonized, right? But if we gave the same weight, maybe that would help language attitudes on the island, and as well test scores, performance scores, and the ability to engage in particular speech in either language. So that's what I like about this paper. It's like talking about the different layers of competence, no? And there are other papers on bilingualism that talk about active bilingualism, passive, you're a recipient bilingual, which would be the same as ese último que I keep forgetting, recipient bilingual would be the same as, is it recognizing, algo así. So it's important to realize that when you learn a language, you may learn a language or know a language to different extents that you fully are able to engage in abstract discussion to, oh, I just recognize it, right? And how do we take this knowledge of competence and kind of design our language classrooms around that? Okay, sorry.
That's why the authors makes a difference between what is acquisition and what is learning a language.
Exacto. Sorry, continue. I just wanted to say something. How are you doing in terms of your content?
Oh, I was going back to this slide, but I'm going back to my final thing.
Okay, go ahead, take it away. Sorry for that.
So no, it's okay. So this paper, the reflection I took out from this, that was that since repertoires can vary between individuals, defining what is true language in a community can be problematic. So this would suggest that speech communities are not static. So I might add that if speech communities are not static, then that would raise a question of what is language, like you were saying. And at the end of all, the best explanation for it would be that repertoires are the language. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much, Jan. How's everyone? Are you alive? You've been awfully quiet.
Yes.
By the way, oh, I'm sorry. No.
Uh-huh. By the way, what? Yeah.
That this topic, I was, my background is not in linguistics, it's more in psychology. So I could relate this a lot with Piaget and Vygotsky and many other developmental theorists that often emphasize the concept of scaffolding in society. So we could build up a language. You were saying practically a critique to our governmental and education institutions that don't promote both languages, English and Spanish, equally. Even in other countries, the same thing happens. So applying this to psychology theory would be the best option to give the same weight to both languages, or whatever languages are most used in the person's context. But yeah, I saw a lot of relationship to the psychological theories I've been studying.
Yeah, that's good.
I really liked it a lot.
Okay, it's
but
good.
I must admit it was very difficult for me to read this paper, because I have no knowledge at all about linguistics. So I was kind of reading in other places so I could understand a little bit more.
I think you did really well, Yang. I'm very impressed, especially the whole contextualizing historical bit. I think it's incredibly important for people to understand the state of linguistics right now, because it's almost like we've been talking about terms that are kind of the same, not the same, but they kind of hint of the current status of our world, late modernity. What terms have come up? Translanguaging, superdiversity, indexicality. These are terms that challenge traditional conceptualizations or traditional ways that we envisioned the language and people, okay? So almost as if they could be discussed as post-structuralist. But yes, you did really well. And also I liked the parallel that you made with Vygotsky in sociolinguistics and also in our department. I know that in language education classes that Rosita and Sandra, they talk a lot about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, because I'm always seeing that in everyone's thesis. So it's good that, you know, we have that overlap in theory or you know, from the pedagogical perspective. Does anyone want to add a reflection or something that you were able to take away from Jan's paper on superdiversity?
I just want to add that I think that this paper really helps those that are always, I guess, hard on themselves for not being able to speak two or more of the languages that they know fluently, and always discrediting themselves for not being able to do that, you know, speak to complete fluency or proficiency. Because I think the concept of understanding linguistic repertoires helps you appreciate that it's not just language, it's not just static or linear. So I like that.
That's a really good point, Tyke. Yes, the repertoires definitely give people more. Like we can appreciate people's diversity and all the languages that they know and their experiences with them. We recognize more. It's additive. It's not subtractive. No, it's much nicer and also realistic. What else? Anyone else want to?
I wanted to comment that in terms of like linguistic repertoire, to make it easier for myself to understand that, I kind of see it as a, you know, a linguistic resume, where you have all of those little knowledge bits of language that you put into a document, and you're like, mira, this is what all the things that I've gathered from different languages or my own language, and I put them into one place and I use them as I see accordingly.
Yeah, exactly, Kiyomara. Kiyomari, why did I say Kiyomari? Yes, exactly. So it's like indicative essentially of your life experiences. He goes as far as in one moment when, you know, Yang says, he uses the word biography, right? We all have different experiences, and these experiences ultimately influence how we perceive the world and sometimes how we behave and speak. So yeah, it's you and me. We all have different idiolects or indexical biographies. Do you guys know that term, idiolects? Have I mentioned it before?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
It's a really old term in sociolinguistics. I think it first came out in the 40s or the 50s, but people still use it to talk about like people's unique way of speaking, because not everybody sounds the same. So, but their dialect, everyone has an idiolect. Yeah. So this is just perhaps another term to talk about it, but in terms of competence and learning experiences. Okay, so we're almost about done. Does anyone want to share their perspective on this? Do you think that superdiversity as a term could define the linguistic situation in Puerto Rico, or what do you guys think? Could it be used and applied to Puerto Rico?
I think so. Of course, over here we have a focus, as Jan was explaining in his presentation. The focus here is always Spanish and English. I would say, like, generally speaking, we don't consider other languages, you know, as being part of the local or popular repertoires, but it will be interesting to also consider Korean. Like, a lot of people are interested in Korean through K-dramas and movies, for example. And I think that looking at the concepts such as the different kinds or levels of competence that this paper considers, it would be interesting to also see that although generally speaking and in education, there are only a few public schools, for example, that cover other languages, even if we're just focusing on Spanish and English, it I think it can be applied here. And as Taik was mentioning, it would be interesting to talk a bit more about it in terms of repertoires and not just the traditional description of what it means to be bilingual. Because if we just focus on the traditional definition or description, it becomes either, as you mentioned, additive or subtractive. And this kind of terms allows for a more flexible perception of what it means to be bilingual and not put so much pressure in the individual on this like idea of perfection, which is unfortunately how bilingualism, in my opinion, is in Puerto Rico, with the histories we have with the languages, and also related to what you mentioned between private schools and public schools. Like if a person is from a public school, based on my experience, I think they're not usually perceived or commonly perceived as fully bilingual, but then if they come from a private school, they might be perceived as fully bilingual because they came from a private school. So there's a lot to think about in Puerto Rico, and I'm sure this happens in other countries as well. But en resumen, yes, I think it can be applied here, and I think it will be interesting to consider other languages that people are learning because of their personal interests, which Dan also mentioned is important when we're considering languages and why people want to learn the language, motivation, and things like that.
Very, very complete reflection. Definitely so. So it's interesting because it considers globalization, global trends, and us coming into contact with different cultures, different languages, and how that individually impacts us and who we are, away from, traditional perspectives of this is what it means to be part of X or Y speech community. No, so it's making room for those other contexts. But as well as Yang and Jarita, you also mentioned, we have to consider that, in Puerto Rico, I have like a sparkle here. It's it's mainly spoken about in terms of Spanish and English, and something that we need to consider about these papers of translanguaging and superdiversity that may be the context where the researcher is writing these sociological constructs, maybe that's impacting their theoretical inclinations. And this is something that not many people think about. It's like a meta idea. No, so one of the key criticisms in sociolinguistics and a lot of social sciences is that they focus on European Western contexts, but then other contexts are kind of like not necessarily part of the dominant discourse. And also there's talk about incorporating more the global South, which is like a region of developing countries, right? So if we were to consider these other regions that don't necessarily have this like diversity or access as much to these global flows and trends, how would the term superdiversity work there? There's a lot of things to consider. In Puerto Rico, we're still bounded by class differences. So would that influence or impact the extent to which we appropriate these talks about multi-competence and so on and so forth? Anyway, so time is up. Thank you guys for participating. On Thursday, we're gonna hear the counter argument to superdiversity. Who's presenting on Thursday? Is it Natalia? Or who's presenting on Thursday?
Yeah, it should be me.
Okay, so you're presenting the counter argument to superdiversity. Am I correct?
Yes,
Okay, you ready for that?
sort of.
All right, so if you have any questions, you can meet with me tomorrow from 1 to 3. I have virtual office hours tomorrow. Okay, so have a great day, everyone. Thank you for participating. Thank you
Have a
very
nice day.
much for your
Thank you. Have a good
Nice
day.
Thank you.
Day.
Very well done, Yang. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
I was very, I was, déjame